want to do is, as Andrew said, talk about the book, but death by 1,000 cuts also as a form of execution, which the book treats. Death by 1,000 cuts is the Western term for a very notorious late imperial Chinese state form of execution, known in Chinese as Lingsha, the characters and the romanization, also known as the lingering death. Both death by 1,000 cuts and the term lingering death are generally inaccurate, and I'll get to that later. So what I want to do is talk both about the form of the death penalty that this was and about the book. But before I do, I should maybe address the question of why this topic, which a number of people raised with me when the book first came out, saying it's a sort of strange, curious, gruesome topic. Why did we take that up? The book is by myself, Timothy Brooke, of UBC, formerly of UBC in Oxford, and Jerome Bourdon of the University of Lyon. And we took up the topic partly because it was there. I mean, this was a pure research topic, and the form of death known as Lingsha, the form of execution, is in the Chinese literature and in the Western literature and hadn't been much studied, even though it comes up regularly. Of course, the term death by 1,000 cuts is often used in English and in French, without nowadays much recognition of where it came from. It does come from this particular form of execution. And what we wanted to do is discuss and find out what the meaning and significance of the form of execution was within the Chinese imperial framework. But it also tied in with some biographical background as well. When the three of us were young, and we date from a time that we were young in the 50s and the 60s, it was quite common to talk about Chinese torture among schoolboys on the playground, and there would be shudders, and this was seen as the most terrible thing, and often what was referred to as Chinese torture was water torture, which is now famous from Abu Ghraib and other places, which in fact was not a Chinese torture. And a lot of the torture stories have been connected with East Asia, have actually been not East Asian in origin, but have come from the European tradition. And much of the reading of Lingsha, as we found in Death by 1,000 Cuts, comes refracted through Western lenses. But when we were young, there were strong images of cruelty associated with China in particular. The literature, the novels and the films of Dr. Fu Manchu, who some of you might remember. I think probably most younger people don't know them, but this was, if you know the Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Fu Manchu was a kind of Chinese Mandarin Dr. Moriarty, who wanted to take over the world, and who also had sadistic sexual tendencies as well, and was involved in things like white slavery. So this was a strong sort of imagery when we were young, and we wanted to trace this. The book itself comes out of a conference held in early 2001, before 9/11, on representations of torture and tormented executions in China, which has quite a literature around it, and many of those images still float around quite a lot. So I want to talk first some about the book and what the book does, and then I want to turn to consider the form of execution briefly and go through some of the aspects of it that we found in this research, and then I want to turn in the last part of the talk to Western representations and treatments of both this form of execution and the broader subject of Chinese torture and execution, in which, in terms of representations history, this form of particular form needs to be placed. So the book itself tried to do a number of tasks, and the Journal of Asian Studies review pointed out a number of those which are important. First of all, it traces the history of the execution and reconstructs that. Secondly, it clarifies a number of things, including the judicial context for the execution, the ideological background and meaning, and it also considers how this particular form of execution compares to other forms of gruesome execution in other parts of the world. And in that sense, we were inspired partly or shaped by the anthropologist Talal Assad's discussion about understanding cruelty and punishments in other civilizations and calling for comparative ethnography of various societies and how they deploy treatments of the body, harsh treatments of the body, painful treatments of the body. And finally, the book also looks to examine how Chinese torture and executions in general, but this particular one in particular, were represented in the West. And in fact, the second and third of those tasks, the clarification of the ideological and judicial context, and the treatment of the Western representations both proved very important for understanding the history of the execution itself. The Western representations in particular are quite graphic in the 19th century, and although they are indeed heavily laden with Orientalist distortions that Amber referred to, they're also very valuable for understanding what actually went on in the form of execution if one can extract the genuine kernel from the Orientalist shaft. They're important partly because although lynch as a form of execution is often mentioned and documented in the Chinese records, it's rarely described, and what actually went on is almost never described, and this ties in with the broader cultural and political disposition not to go into forms of violence and not to give them a lot of time and space. So I want to turn now to the issue of lynch as a form of the death penalty in mid and late imperial China. And I'm boiling down a lot of material here, but I want to start with a few negations to begin with. First of all, death by 1,000 cuts, as it came to be known in the Western literature, was not death by 1,000 cuts. Usually the execution involved between 12 and 36 cuts to dismember the body. The first reference in the Western literature was to death by 10,000 cuts. It's even larger than the standard came to be. But in fact, this form of dismemberment involved a smaller number of cuts. Secondly, it wasn't usually a lingering death, despite the other form of the name. Usually death came on the third or the fourth cut, and the dismemberment of the body took place thereafter once the person was dead. And finally, it wasn't usually characterized, at least in the 19th century, probably the 18th and 19th century, by the great amount of pain that normally causes shudders when this kind of execution is mentioned. I mentioned this to an oncologist friend at one point, and I've seen a lot that he shuddered for several minutes just thinking about it. But in fact, usually the person being executed was heavily drugged with opium before the lynching began. The context for the execution was that it was carried out as part of the late imperial justice system. It was well in place during the Ming and Qing dynasties, so that means from the 14th century down until its abolition in 1905. And lynching was the worst or the most dramatic of the three kinds of execution that were stipulated in the Ming and the Qing legal codes, vast legal codes, including statutes, sub-statutes, commentary on the statutes. The Ming and Qing legal codes were highly articulated forms of law, which was not was often forgotten in the West, certainly in popular circles. And lynching was seen as the worst of the three kinds of execution. The three other two were strangulation and beheading. Dismemberment by lyncher was the third and the last kind. The beheading and lyncher were seen as the worst because they involved a violation of the somatic integrity of the individual and of the individual as a member of the family. So they weren't especially feared because of the pain involved, but because of the violence that they did to the body in degrading it. We also found that throughout the late imperial period, from the 14th century onward, although this was a punishment that was used frequently, or on a regular basis in any case, it wasn't used with the same amount of frequency. And there were peaks for its use in the late 14th century under the first Ming emperors. They used it to fight what they saw as corruption, treasonous corruption. And in the late mid-19th century, at the time of the great rebellions against the Qing in its final decades. This was a form of execution that was used for specific types of infraction, particularly regicide, parricide, attempts to kill parents or grandparents or senior members of a family, and also mass murders and treason. In the 19th century, most of the executions of this sort were carried out because they were part of the people who were executed were involved in rebellious activities that were seen as treasonous. One of the fascinating parts of the story that was dwelt on in the review in the Journal of Asian Studies were the complicated origins of the practice. And the tradition has been that the origins go back to the nomadic dynasties of the 10th century. Liao and the Mongols in the 13th century. And we approached that claim with some skepticism because the claim was that this was a barbarous intervention into Chinese practice. But the research seems to indicate that indeed there were nomadic origins to this from the Chitangli people who formed the Liao dynasty in North China in the 10th century. The situation is somewhat difficult to work out, but on the basis of linguistic evidence and documentary testimony, it seems that those were the origins. However, the practice was taken over first by the Song dynasty in the 11th to 13th century, then by the Mongols in the 13th and 14th centuries, and then became part of the standard codes in the last two imperial dynasties, the Ming and the Qing. The rationale for using this particular kind of punishment, dismemberment, the meaning within the culture was diverse. From the point of view of the state, it seems that the state simply sought to demonstrate its power of the virtuous ruler, as opposed to those its power over those who carried out infractions against the most basic values of the society and of the state. Popularly, however, there was also the view that there was a profound violation of the body's integrity, as I said. These are two different kind of rationales, and one of the difficulties of discussing the meaning of the practice is that Chinese jurists, for the most part, do not give any justification. That is to say, within the judicial philosophy literature, we found no justifications of this practice. It was generally condemned as both barbarous and cruel from the time it was first introduced into the literature. And those criticisms over nearly a millennium, from the early 10th century down until the abolition in 1905, were mobilized by leading Chinese legal thinkers in the late 19th century, in particular Shen Jiaben, to call for the abolition of the practice of lynching after the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The Boxer Rebellion the Boxer Rebellion resulted in, as many of you will know, the occupation of North China and the capital in particular, by the forces of 8 imperial powers. And from that time onward, there were strong pressures upon the Qing government to reform itself. That impetus, together with the judicial philosophy criticisms that had been around of lynching for some time, led to the abolition, fed into the abolition of 1905, which also the Qing government undertook as a way of meeting Western criticisms of China that it had a barbarous and primitive legal and constitutional system that made the Chinese government unable or unworthy to participate as an equal in the international relations system at the time. So the Chinese government had a number of incentives to cite marshal a number of kinds of arguments for finally abolishing lynching in 1905. Now, I want to show, do we have anything on the screen? Here's the characters. This is the first depiction of the process of lynching in 1910, published in a Western book by a Frenchman by the name of Jean-Martin, who was the doctor in the French legation at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. And what the picture shows is the execution or carving of a male body. We have from the early 19th century, between 1900, suppression of the Boxers, and 1905, the abolition of lynching, a number of sets of Western photographs that were taken that record the practice and the reactions of the crowds to the execution. And these are valuable evidence for testing various assertions in the literature about what was going on within lynching. I don't want you to dwell on that for too long, so I'm going to take it off the screen. And I'm going to come back to some other illustrations in a moment. But first, let me shift now to the last part of the talk, which is about the Western treatments of lynching, both as evidence and as propaganda, treating lynching as a form of torture and of execution. What we have done in the book is to put these representations into the broader framework of Western representations of Chinese law, Chinese society, Chinese culture, and in particular into representations of Chinese torture and execution, broadly speaking, as well as putting it into comparative perspective between societies. The photographs that were taken, including the one that I just showed you, were made possible partly between 1900 and 1905, just on the eve of the abolition of the practice, because Westerners were able to travel in the capital and in North China more broadly than they had been before. It was also made possible technologically by the introduction in the 1890s of the portable fast shutter camera, which allowed for scenes of execution to take place that didn't require people to stand around for 5 minutes not moving in order to have their picture taken. These photographs drew on older tropes of Chinese punishment and cruelty over the previous century, since the first Westerners went in the early modern period to China in the 16th century. And we can divide that history up into 3 phases. The earliest representations of China in the 16th and 17th century included a range of representations. On the one hand, China in some sources was presented as a land full of prisons, in which everyone was ruled by fear. And on the other hand, China was presented from this early time onward as a land of humane, rational justice. And these two contrasting images were in place through the 17th century. Especially, and let me show you a number of images from that time. So this is one of the first pictorial, probably the first pictorial treatment of Chinese ethnographic material. Came in the famous series of volumes on voyages published by the Debris brothers in around 1600. And this shows a man having his feet pressed as part of judicial inquisitional torture process. One of the iconic forms of Chinese punishment that was pictured in the Western literature from the 16th century down until the early 20th century is the kan, sometimes called the portable pillory, which was a large wooden, piece of wood that was clamped around the neck. And this is a rather small picture, but you'll see on this famous volume from the 1670s, the frontispiece of the volume has at the very forefront of the image a man with a kan around his neck, languishing in front of the ruler. Another of the important images, together with the kan, that was pictured as typical of Chinese punishments was the beating with the bamboo. And this was portrayed from the early 17th century repeatedly in Western iconography down until the end of the imperial era in 1911. These various kinds of punishment were not seen as particularly horrific. They were seen more as quaint. And that was also the case with forms of execution for the most part as well. That contrasted with images of Chinese prisons, which were generally portrayed as rather horrific, and that reflected the experience of missionaries who were locked up in them at various points. And for the 16th, 17th, early 18th century, our main sources of information about China come from missionaries, mainly Jesuits, but also Dominicans and Franciscans who wrote various treatises. First mention of lynching came in the 1690s by one of the French Jesuits, Louis Leconte, who was the one who called it death by 10,000 cuts. Didn't make a great deal of fuss about it, and this was at the time when spectacular punishments, gruesome punishments were still the rule within European society, practiced by various European states. In the 18th century, there were various debates during the Enlightenment about Chinese government, and Chinese punishments were entered into those debates in various ways. Within the debates, China was portrayed by some as a model of enlightened despotism that should be imitated by European statesmen, and by others, and this was people like Voltaire, for example, and the physiocrats in the 18th century, in 18th century France. On the other hand, in contrast, in opposition to the previous position, China was also portrayed as a despotism based on fear and cruelty, which there was no real legal process. And that was the position laid out first by Montesquieu, and then followed up by a number of other late Enlightenment and especially Romantic thinkers. First linkage of cruelty, cruelty carried out for pleasure, was, in regard to China, introduced by the Marquis de Sade in the 1790s, who argued Chinese mandarins loved to slaughter their people and they derived pleasure from that, and therefore they imposed hardships on them in order to provoke rebellion, which they could, for pleasure, repress. Sade predicted that eventually there would be a vast popular revolution that would kill off the mandarins, and that would be a time for real rejoicing. This was Sade writing in the midst of the French Revolution. That notion of cruelty carried out for pleasure, and in particular for sexual pleasure, was one that entered into the Orientalist literature of the 19th century fairly early on. And that's been traced in particular by Martine Astier-Lufti, showing that this is quite a typical trope in Orientalist literature. That deserves some specification. It was typical of Orientalist literature regarding the Islamic lands, and for most of the 19th century, that kind of view of sexual pleasure linked to violence and cruelty was not found in the literature on China down until the very end of the 19th century, on the eve of the Boxer Rebellion. Through the, let me just see what I've got. So here are a number of further 17th century depictions, debate on Chinese government, the 18th century the early 19th century, the early 19th century saw a reproduction of the older kinds of tropes of Chinese punishment. Picture of someone being bambooed, being beaten by the bamboo, another one, a man wearing a kong. These came in the volumes from the McCartney embassy sent by Britain, by the British East India Company to China in 1896, and broadly circulated thereafter in three volumes that shaped Western opinions in important ways, particularly British, but not only. The main theme in the 19th century relating to Chinese punishment, judicial torture, was to treat it as cruel and barbarous. And the pictorial tradition, particularly in Britain, was strong on this theme. These pictures that I've just shown you were by William Alexander, a member of the McCartney embassy. And a more important contribution, and a more sensational one, came in 1805 with the publication of a small bilingual French-English booklet called The Punishments of China by George Henry Mason, who drew on watercolors that he had picked up as a British Army officer on leave from India, visiting Canton. And these watercolors, because they were painted by Chinese artists, he portrayed as typical of authentic Chinese punishments. In fact, the watercolor industry in the late 18th century was for experts and had been shaped very much by kinds of things that Westerners demanded. And these illustrations that he picks up are things that are fantastic, or to a large extent, punishments that were fantastic, but dramatic. Here's this picture of the Kong. These illustrations mixed real punishments and forms of judicial torture, inquisitional torture, with fantastically. The Kong was, of course, real. So too was the beating with the bamboo. Hamstringing was not generally, it was not an official punishment in the imperial system. Strangulation was. This is something that in the Western tradition is called the escapade, hanging someone from a bar. And Mason called it the punishment of the swing in English. Not a official Chinese punishment, something that was from the Western tradition that had been introduced into the Cantonese watercolor pictures. Here's one called Tearing the Body Under. Once again, not something that was a actual punishment within Imperial China, but one that was portrayed very broadly through British society, through Mason's work. Mason's work, published first in 1805, went through 5 editions by 1830, seems to have sold well. It went through editions together with pictures by Alexander, who we saw before, and by other writers as well. So this kind of illustrative material in the early 19th century fits well with Edward Said's thesis that ideas and images were used to mobilize opinion prior to aggression about other parts of society, towards other parts of the world. Portraying arbitrary cruelty was a reason why it would be justified to intervene in China in particular. It's worth noting that the depictions that Mason gave of Chinese torture and executions, he likened to the kinds of things that were practiced in the Spanish Inquisition by Roman Catholics. So that Catholic-Protestant divide and the imagery coming out of that was transferred onto Asia as well. Mason's work was criticized by China experts of his day, in particular two, George Staunton, who really threw the book at him in the sense that he translated the Qing legal code in 500 pages, that is to say the main statutes, not even including sub-statutes, and showed that far from being arbitrary and cruel, far from being arbitrary, the Qing punishments were well laid out, were rationally aligned with the crimes that they were meant to be punishing, and that many of the tortures and executions and other forms of punishment that were shown by Mason were simply fanciful. That criticism was built on by another of the leading 19th century China specialists, John Francis Davis, eventually the second governor of Hong Kong, who showed that the images that Mason had put forward were actually drawn from Buddhist iconographies of hell, punishments that were meted out to the evil in hell. Now, a couple of the things that Mason portrayed actually had been punishments in ancient China, in the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty. For example, cutting in half was an official punishment during the Tang. It hadn't been practiced for 1,000 years by the time that Mason wrote. It had been included in the old religious iconography, but it was no longer anything like current. Later in the century, and I'm glossing over a lot of material here, further contribution to, excuse me for skipping through the Mason material. So let me just linger on this one. Strangulation on the left, a real punishment. Disemboweling on the right, not an actual punishment. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see dismemberment, which is a kind of lyncha or similar to lyncha. All very stylized, not very realistic. There were realistic pictures of lyncha around at this period. For example, this one, which was taken from a Russian diplomat who had a painting of his own. Done. Another major contribution to imagery of Chinese torture and punishment came in the late 1850s. It was carried out by the famous Victorian illustrator, George Cruikshank, and his nephew, Percy. It was commissioned by Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, during the Second Opium War, and it was circulated at the time of the election, which Palmerston fought on going to war with China. And the material was clearly presented to show that China was a barbarous country which needed to be put in its place. Palmerston is famous for saying that countries like China and the Latin American republics need a good caning every 10 years or so to keep them in their place. And the punishments shown in the booklet put out by the Cruikshank were wartime propaganda showing Chinese punishments and tortures as cruel. In the late 19th century, let me just give you a few of them. Many of these were fanciful, a few of them were real. Here's one that's sawing in half, not anything close to an official Chinese punishment. To awaken more sympathy, Cruikshanks explained that the victim was female. Can't see, so who's to know? What we do see is this one comes from the Buddhist iconography. You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, same punishment being meted out. But that was not in line with Chinese imperial practice, more in line with early modern Western European practice. Here's a picture from Lucas Cranach the Elder's work on the saw as a means of torture and execution. And this kind of execution with someone being held upside down and then sawed through between their legs. We have various kinds of iconography on this. The Western tradition, compared to the Chinese, is very full of depictions, both verbally descriptions and illustrative depictions of torture. In fact, one of the medieval or early modern works on Western torture, Sachsenspiegel, probably contains more depictions of torture and execution in itself than the entire Chinese imperial tradition does. So this is one of the reasons why there's an interest in looking at Western sources, because they do have material. They don't shy away from portraying graphic material, even though often it's fanciful. Come back to that one. So through the late 19th century, there were divergent opinions still about the meaning of Chinese torture. Some argued at Chinese punishment, some argued that it was necessary to control a criminally inclined, violent populace that had no Christian moral scruples to restrain it. Others articulated the view that if you understood the Chinese legal system as a whole, it was not so dissimilar from the Western systems to which it was normally compared unfavorably. And it was in this kind of debate that was going on that the first pictures of Ling Chu began to circulate, particularly supporting the argument that China was a primitive society. Social Darwinist evolutionist view at the time being that primitive societies were cruel. Cruelty went together with harsh punishments. Here's a picture, one of the first ones published, of a Ling Chu victim. It was published with the caption, "This page has been perforated so that the purchaser of the book can remove it in case they don't want to retain a permanent illustration of the condition of contemporary China." So Ling Chu victim at the time of talk about partitioning China was taken as emblematic of the society as a whole. So again, I don't really want you to linger on that one. Oh, final twist to the story, I'm sorry, I'll wind up presently. The notion that Chinese torture was somehow linked to sexual sadism came, as I said, on the eve of the Boxer Rebellion. Started with the novel by Octave Mirbeau, the Parisian novelist, who actually depicted a contrast between what he portrayed as subtle Chinese tortures and the Western crude torture of the colonial world and its colonial subjects. And this particular novel, which circulated broadly in France and in other countries by people who read French, certainly very influential, portrayed a British woman traveling to Canton, going to a torture garden. The name of the volume in English is The Torture Garden, in French, Le Jardin des Supplices, and enjoying seeing Chinese people tortured to death. So this was a kind of colonial sadism, but the image was then taken over and applied to Chinese people themselves. It wasn't helped by the fact that Auguste Rodin, the famous sculptor and an engraver, presented silk screens for the second edition of the work, of Mirbeau's work. And these showed a woman enjoying herself while the descriptions of the torture were going on. So, to conclude, how do I stop that? Just stop it there. To conclude, Ling Chu was a significant feature of the late imperial judicial system in China. It does qualify as what we now consider cruel and degrading punishment. Was considered that by Chinese jurists at the time, but presenting it as a wanton, sadistic kind of cruelty was part of the racist abuse at the time of the colonial era. So I'll end up there because I've already gone past what I wanted to. Thank you very much for that.